Morning, everybody. How are you? Welcome back to the Spurs Talk Show. I'm Sean. Bugsy's up in front. This is episode 171 of Tottenham Walks. Guys, please do me a favour. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe, smash the notification bell. Drop a comment on today's topics. And I do want your feedback on the second half of the video because I'm not sure how I land on my own opinion on this one. I'm just kind of contemplating it. And I want to put it out there. See how it lands with you guys. Tell me if I'm wildly wrong. I could be wildly wrong on this. I'm happy to be educated. But it's about the difference between a club signing and a manager signing or a Conte signing. Because it's often used as a discussion point. It's part of the extension of the whole, was Conte backed? Was any manager backed? Routine, the regime. That we go through in the community, and I don't know if it's necessarily wrong to be thinking about that stuff. I'm not saying that, but I do think it gets more attention and a little bit more critique than I think is reasonable, and I'll explain why. But before we get to that, a little bit of transfer news today. And it's probably a pertinent transfer news story to bring in the later conversation, and it's about Alex Scott, the Bristol City central midfielder, the 19-year-old. Tricky winger, very capable. He's nippy, he's fast. He can play off both feet, low centre of gravity. He's got a really good range of passing. Incredibly intelligent for someone of his age. And, is the superstar of that team. Tottenham were interested in him last summer. And, according to reports, we're upping our interest now. The suggested bid that would be, required to take him off of Bristol City's hands, and it is likely he is going to leave Bristol City this summer, is 25 million quid. And I think he's played basically 35 games this season. I think he's only got one goal. He may have got two, but he's more of a creative player. Although I do think someone of his talent probably should have got a couple more in the net than he actually has, but I'm not going to criticise him because I think he's a really, really top talented player. And look, I've kept an eye on him a little bit when I can remember to watch the league review. I often keep an eye out for him, and he always looks good for them. He does look like he's a step above that particular level, but that doesn't mean that he's necessarily ready for the Premier League. Now, we saw him play against Manchester City in the FA Cup, and he was phenomenal on the night, I thought. Didn't shy away from stepping up to playing against one of the best teams in the world. And he should have been proud of his performance, right? And I think it probably got a lot more attention. His name got a lot more attention following that. And there probably will be a long list of suitors for him in the summer. Manchester City might even be looking at him, from what I read this morning. Now, what the problem for me is, not the problem, but the risk. There's a never-ending stream of young players that have been hot prospects, if you like, in the past, who have then had the opportunity to show their talents against, a bigger team in a cup competition, and have grabbed the ball by both horns and ran with it. Only to then get sort of snapped up by a bigger club and then disappear off the face of the earth. I think someone like John Bostock probably was a good example in Tottenham, but there's literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of hot prospects that turn cold very quickly. And 25 million quid, I know it's not a lot of money in today's market, but it probably is going to be a not insignificant dent into whatever budget Tottenham will have in the summer. And that budget, of course, is going to be massively influenced by where we finish in the league. I know a lot of people right now are kind of rolling their eyes at the top four conversation because in no small part they feel so disappointed and dejected and despondent following the shitty start to March that we had, getting booted out of both competitions that we still had chances in, and beaten by teams that we should have been beating or that were eminently beatable. And so a lot of people probably are a bit still blasé about the getting back into the top 4 race. But you know what? I think over time, as the business end of the season starts to kick in, it's a fascinating top 4 race, and it's also a fascinating relegation battle as well. I think there's like 6 points or something that separates 12th from 20th. It's amazing. And so I think that we've got a recency bias because we're so close in proximity to the disappointments of last week. But I think in a week or two's time, people will start to refocus and regather some enthusiasm for the top 4 race. Look, it's not a trophy, but it is important, especially for owners, for clubs who have owners like ours who have made it abundantly clear that you have to live within your means. And so the revenue streams that come from prize money, from future media revenues and campaign financing from the Champions League is significant. And if we finish 4th versus finish 5th, our transfer budget could be twice as big, as it would otherwise be if you finish 5th or lower. And so how much of a slab is 25 million of whatever budget we have is another conversation, another consideration. And is he going to come in and participate in the first team? I don't know. I mean, I don't watch him that closely, and even if you do, you don't really know how good he is playing against League One opposition every week. And so you need to probably assume that he'll be loaned out. There's a never-ending stream of recent examples of players that have cost 25 million quid, or not necessarily that much less than that, and been loaned out immediately. Brian Hill, Pape Sarr's a little bit less, obviously, but there's lots of young players that are coming through at Tottenham that get loaned out. So I don't necessarily think that we should expect to see him in the first team, and so that would be considered a club signing, especially if the manager next season is Antonio Conte. Now, I personally believe that the chances of him being here next season are about 5%. I think it's 50-50 whether he even makes it to the end of the season. But if he is here, then I don't think there's any point in buying Alex Scott, because Antonio Conte just doesn't have that much interest in developing young players outside of duress. When injuries force the issue, that's the only reason Ollie Skip is having an extended run in the team. It's the only reason Pape Sarr got in the team in the first place and did well. It's the only reason Brian Hill got in the team. So, to me, if Conte's still here, then Alex Scott would be a waste of money, because we need to use as much of that budget as possible in far more pressing areas, like the 2 centre-backs we need to improve on, the goalkeeper, and God forbid Harry Kane decides to jump ship, then a striker as well. Alex Scott could be the creative player that we're looking for. He does play in the middle, but he can also play off the left and the right. He can dribble well. He's got, like I said already, a wonderful eye for a pass. He might just be the future, but it's a big risk, a big gamble, and I don't think that it makes any sense if Conte's still here. If Conte isn't still here, if someone else is that has a project manager ethos to his name, and someone who has all the intentions of developing youth, someone like Pochettino, someone like the Gallardo fella from River Plate, then maybe it makes more sense. But only if he hangs around and doesn't get sent out on loan. That's my take on it. But we'll see what happens. Where I wanted to go with the whole conversation, though, guys, was about this idea of, club signing versus player signing. Conte made it abundantly clear, much to my distaste at the time, that Jed Spence wasn't a manager signing. It was a club signing that he was okay with. He kind of tolerated it, which again, I didn't like the way that he said that publicly to a new kid who's just starting his career at Tottenham, to then be told by your manager that you're hopefully trying to impress. The only reason you're here is because he was okay with the club making the decision, but it wasn't one that he would have made himself. Not a cool opening day if I'm Jed Spence. And he said something similar about Danjuma last week. He said, that Danjuma, when asked why he wasn't playing, alongside the kind of defence of his tactics, saying that I have to make have to do my job and the players have to do theirs. He said that Danjuma's not necessarily a number 10, he's more of a second striker or a winger. And I don't really understand why he would answer it that way, because it wasn't as though we ever played with a number 10, or incredibly rarely do we ever play with a number 10. So why would he suggest the reason he didn't play was because Danjuma doesn't fit a role that we don't ever use anyway? It's very odd, right? But he also made it clear that Danjuma was a club signing, not a Conte signing. And here's where I'm going to go with it, right? So on that particular instance, that particular scenario, if you are a manager that only has 6 months left of your contract and the club is signing a player on loan for only 6 months with no real intention or necessary desire to sign him on any permanent deal, then, I think it makes absolute sense, it's common sense, logic, to suggest that the manager should be on board with him. If the only time the player's going to spend at the club is for the period of time left on the contract of the managerial tenure, then not having the manager's approval, or not just approval but desire to sign him, is illogical. It's stupid, because you're taking up a squad space and the manager has no need for him, desire to play him, etc. So if Danjuma was a club signing that Conte didn't want and it was only on loan for 6 months, then it was stupid, and Daniel Levy and Paratici need to give their heads a wobble, 100%, because there's absolutely no benefit in it. Where I would change my tune though is when it comes to players that are signed on long-term contracts, like Jed Spence. But I'm not just going to talk about Tottenham here, I'll talk about any club, because there is a massive difference between the average managerial tenure and the average player tenure in a one contract player. So the reason why I wanted to sort of bring the Alex Scott conversation and merge it into this topic that I'm not really sure how I feel about is because you could use the Alex Scott example as, if it does happen, whether he's a manager signing, a Conte signing, if he's still here, or whether it's a club signing. And this concept of club signings is often used as a stick to beat Daniel Levy with, or a stick to beat Paratici with. And I don't necessarily know if it should be. And here's why. You have to bear with me for a second. I'm going to have to give you some sort of statistics or data to kind of back it up, right? But so there's, in the community, a lot of people talk about the fact that, you can't keep blaming the manager. We've had 15 managers. We're on manager 15. It's blame the owner. When you look into it, it sounds, on paper, it sounds crazy. 15 failed managers. That's insane. But when you think about how long that period's been and then compare it to the average Premier League club, it doesn't sound quite as crazy. So first and foremost, it's not really 15 managers, it's 12 managers. 3 of those managers that are included in that list are caretakers. Ryan Mason, Clive Allen, and then one of the stints of David Pleat. He was a full-time manager for 9 months, but he also had a second stint in Daniel Levy's tenure that lasted about 30 days, where he was just a caretaker. So I don't think it's fair to include them on the list, because they were never failed processes, they were stopgaps, right, until the situation became clear on who they wanted to bring in. So really that should be 12. 12 into 23 years, as how long Daniel Levy's been at the club, is just under 2 years per average manager tenure, which is a number, right? Whether it's long or short, we'll just leave it at 2 years, give or take, just under 2 years. In the Premier League overall, there's been about 275 managers, I think, give or take. But the number itself is irrelevant. The average tenure, according to a website, and I'll show it on the screen so you can see I'm not just making it up, is about 770 days or something like that. I haven't got it in front of me, but you'll see it. Forgive me if I'm wrong by a few days. So about 2 years and 1 month, 2 years and 2 months. So not a massive difference in and of itself between Daniel Levy's average managerial tenure and that of every other manager in the Premier League. But when you also think about the wildly extreme examples that exist in about half a dozen cases in the Premier League that distort that average managerial tenure quite dramatically, then it makes the difference even more negligible. I'm talking about Alex Ferguson. I think he was manager for Man United for about 30 years, but about 21 of those were during the Premier League era. Arsene Wenger, 22 years. Joe Kinnear at Wimbledon, 7 or 8 years. Harry Redknapp at West Ham, 8, 9 years. David Moyes at Everton, 10 years. Jurgen Klopp, Liverpool, currently still ongoing, about 8.5 years, whatever it is. So those 5 or 6 examples massively pull up the average tenure. And if you kind of don't necessarily disclude them or discount them, but if you factor that in, then really the difference between the average managerial tenure at Tottenham and that of across the Premier League is not that much difference. So first and foremost, I want to park that idea that, you have to blame the owner, not the managers, because look how many we've gone through. It's a consequence of being in charge for so long that you're going to go through that many managers on average, as so would any other chairman in any other club. But now if you take the argument with me, if you're still following me, and look at the average contract length of a player who comes into a club in the Premier League. I'm not talking about loan deals, I'm not talking about youth team players, but players that come in, in the summer to try and improve the first team. The average tenure of that contract, that first contract, regardless of whether or not they go on and sign a second contract or stay for a decade or whatever, but the first contract is usually about 4 years. You have some that are a little bit lower depending on their age, and you have some that are 5 or 6 years. FIFA says that you shouldn't really sign a player for any more than 6 years, but Chelsea went and signed Mudryk for 8.5 years, obviously for FFP reasons rather than anything else. But so about 4 years, maybe 4.5 years is a typical contract length for a new signing into a Premier League club who wants to try and impact the first team. Now, depending on when that player comes into the club and how far through the current manager of that club is through their average tenure of 2 years, it's likely that that particular player will see 2 or at least 3 different managers during their time at the average Premier League club. So on that basis, is it right that a manager should always get the players that they want and ask the club to sign these players for them, knowing full well that 99 times out of 100, that player is going to still be with the club long after that manager has moved on? I don't think that it should be such a commonly used stick to hit any owner with, that they're buying players for the club, not for the manager, when the reality of the situation is that if you want the player in the first place, you have to factor in that they're going to be here for a lot longer than the manager. So what I would say, rather than having the conversation of and thinking that a club signing is a negative thing, so I don't think it should be. I think the reality of the situation, when you look at the data, is that clubs have to consider the future, knowing full well that the likelihood is that the manager's only going to be there for short term, and that players earn a lot of money. And if you buy them on long-term contracts, which naturally is happening more and more because of amortization purposes and ways to sort of wriggle out of FFP compromises, then you need to have a bit of compromise between the manager and the board. And that's, I think, what happens with Tottenham. That's what's happening with Conte. That's what happened with Jed Spence. But maybe Conte is being very stubborn with his use of Danjuma because he's trying to make a point. And if that's the case, then I don't particularly get on board with it. But he's under no obligation to use a player if he doesn't think he's good enough. And that's why I come back to the initial point that I made, that if the club decided to sign Danjuma on a 6-month loan for a manager that is only here for 6 months, then it makes absolutely no sense to not get the buy-in of the manager. But more importantly, and I think going forward, it makes it even more clearer in my mind, and I know people I speak to feel the same way, that a football club needs to have an ethos and a philosophy that is stuck to and adhered to rigidly around who they're trying to be. What sort of football do they want to play? What sort of fan do they want to attract? What sort of formation. Ideally you'd even have a bit more consistency with the formation, so that you don't have to buy square pegs for round holes for players that play in a back three that are very different sometimes to those that play in a back two. And certainly there's a difference between a right back and a right wing back, or a left back and a left wing back. It's a little bit less obvious, the differences, as you move up the pitch, in my opinion, but certainly in the defensive third there are major differences between the sorts of players that work in different formations. And for me personally, I feel like if you can create an ethos throughout the life blood of the football club, then every player that you are looking to identify, through the Moneyball system, where you're scouring the world's markets for players that have the statistics that generally cater to what your system needs, then it makes it a lot easier for new managers to come in and utilise what they have and not need a full rebuild, not need the 4 or 5 windows that Antonio Conte does to get from the squad that he inherited to the team that he thinks he can use for his system to go on places. And it also allows for the club to then identify managers that fit that ethos as well, rather than identifying a manager that comes in and then after that happens figuring out whether the manager is going to adapt to the squad or the squad is going to adapt to the manager. That shouldn't need to happen if you have a philosophy where everything that you bring into the club, players, fans, managers, coaching staff, everything, are all on board with the general trend of what you're trying to do, and then nobody has to really adapt in any significant way, and everything becomes far easier. You waste less money on players that either don't work out from the start or that worked out for one manager but not for another. You can have fans that are more willing to get behind the team and be more enthusiastic about the process, less impatience, quote unquote, and and they'll generate more revenues by happier fans spending more money on club merchandise. Everything can work in harmony and in synchronicity and in chemistry with one another if the club has a philosophy and an ethos that everything that is then added in is a good fit for. And as I've said before, that may require, when you have the next manager cab off the rank, it may require you to go against your better judgment and not go after the kind of tier 1 category name, who will be the 180 of what we've just left from Antonio Conte, and will likely fail because he has to reinvent the wheel again and change the squad around. Just as it's getting ready for Conte, it needs to go in a different direction. Maybe you go to a tier 2 level manager that follows in the same philosophy as what you're trying to create, and then you don't have to spend as much, you have less waste, less slippage, less errors of judgment, and hopefully over time you have an ethos and a philosophy that everyone can be behind, because it's coherent and cogent and exciting. So I'll leave it there, guys. Let me know though, what are your thoughts on this idea of, first of all, Alex Scott? Do you like him? Do you want him in? But also, more importantly for this conversation, what are your thoughts around the idea of club signings versus Conte signings or coach signings? Should a club signing be thought of as somehow a negative and a problem? When you factor in the reality that coaches and managers are here today, gone tomorrow, and that players are around for a lot longer. Let me know. Cheers, guys. Like, share and subscribe, and as always, come on, you Spurs! Bye-bye.